I was a foster parent with my husband back in 2012, and we grew our family through foster care. We ended up adopting 2 of our 3 kids back in 2013, and then their sister joined us just this past November and made us a family of 5. And now that our family is full, we're done fostering, at least for now, but I really wanted to make sure that I stayed involved with the foster care system, and so now I'm a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, which means I'm appointed by a judge to follow along a case in the foster care system and make sure that I'm advocating for that child as they move through the system. And I know that you're a lawyer by trade and also have some experience with the foster care system, but we haven't ever really sat down and talked about it.
This is the first time.
So talk to me about your involvement.
Well, I started when I was a young lawyer working in legal services, so working with people facing family matters, other types of civil matters. And so when I hung out my own shingle when I was 27 years old, I continued to take on cases and represent people that were, for lack of a better way to put it, going through the system. So and this is back in Kentucky, but I have represented birth parents, relative placements, children in particular, in all stages of being in the foster care system. I've worked with adoptive parents. I love doing adoptions. And have just seen it from all different perspectives. So of course I've worked with CASA. CASAs are amazing. They're such an invaluable resource on a case because you all have the ability to be the eyes and ears and advocates for a child and meet with the teachers and meet with the providers and really provide a comprehensive report to the court that's not only important if you're representing a parent or representing that child, but also I know it's important, it makes a difference to the court. So having, just over 20 years working in that system, you sort of get to see it from all different angles. And so we're here today to talk about foster care in particular, but I think you and I both understand that that's a big umbrella. It covers a lot. So,
and there's so many moving pieces, right?
Yes.
So when I was a foster parent and we had our placement of our 2 kids, our kids had been in the system for their entire lives. When we say that we want permanency for our kids, and the federal laws say that there should be permanency within a year by the time a kid comes into foster care, but we know that in so many times permanency is not achievable in a year. And so for my son, it was a full 7 years that he had been in the system and had multiple lawyers and multiple social workers and multiple therapists and other service providers and educational assessments, and all the way through there was so much change, and I think how much stress that puts on our kids to not just have the stability of their family life, but that whole support network around them is also coming in and coming out because it's their job, right? How do we really create a sense of permanency? And actually that's one of the reasons I was really drawn to being a CASA, is because the CASA that was assigned to our case or our kids' case was the only person that saw them through from the beginning to the end. And that's something that I really value now in being a CASA, is being able to sort of stick with a case all the way through until there really is some sort of permanency. But I will say it was really eye-opening not having encountered the system myself growing up, trying to navigate social services. I mean, it's everything. It's all the services that the biological family needs, and housing and food and educational service. I mean, it touches everything, and it's such a crash course, right? You get to know a little bit of everything, probably just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the biggest failure that I see in the system is when you represent children and you really, or as a CASA, you see it from a child's point of view. And so you mentioned consistency. And the way I describe it to adults is, you and I know if we're going to change our doctor, change our therapist, or we need to change, move, for example. We're making that choice and we understand why. For children, especially young children, they don't understand why that adult is coming in and out of their lives, and they take it as a rejection and an abandonment. And I think that when we look at things that can be done is to really bear in mind what effect is this policy change or this cutting of funding going to have on the child. You know, we give a lot of lip service to doing what's in the best interest of the child or being child focused or child centered, but that's not really true. And I think if you've worked, as you have directly, with children who are feeling these effects and feeling their hurt and their pain, you come at it from a different point of view. And one of the reasons that I continued to represent children all the way until our family came back to Virginia is that it gave me a perspective even when I was working with adults. So I could look at a mother or a father or a relative and say, you know what, let me tell you what this child may actually be thinking that they can't express to you. I have found in my experience that children can go through horrific abuse. It does not mean they love their family less necessarily. And so we as adults, again, we analyze things and we say, well, that makes no sense how you could love someone who hurts you. And so we think maybe having a visit half an hour a week or a supervised hour a month, we think that might be enough because on paper it looks logical and it looks rational. But it's not kind and it's not helpful to the child who's going through a lot of changes.
Yeah.
So I think for me, that's the biggest soapbox I get on is take a step back, get down on the child's level and try to see from a child's point of view what these changes are doing to how he or she is feeling about herself or himself, which in turn affects everything going forward.
Yep. I think so. You know, one of the things we learned when we went through foster parent training was kids do as good as they can in the moment they can with the skills and the resources that they have.
Survival.
And if you know the child's story, whether this is a trauma child's child or your own biological child who, you know, just comes up, if you know the why, it makes 100% sense.
Yes.
One of the things that's been really interesting to me to look at in sort of the child welfare system as a whole is both the tightening of the timeline. So now we're trying to get children to permanency faster, but the courts and the system hasn't necessarily always caught up.
No.
You know, you go to get a court date and it's supposed to be in 90 days, but the court's at a 120-day backlog where, you know, we're drawing this out because lawyers the schedule can't get with the judges and the service providers can't do their assessments in time, and it draws it out. But the other thing that I've really been noticing, and I noticed as a foster parent, but even more as a CASA, is this prioritization over the last, especially 10 years, on preventative services, giving more and more services to families to try to keep them together to prevent the kids from going into foster care. But what that means is that by the time they come into foster care, it is a more significant issue. That it's because we wait till there's a very, very, very high threshold, till every opportunity has been exhausted, you know, to remove a child from their home. The kids that are coming in are more traumatized, have probably, you know, I feel for the social workers trying to find that, like, how hard can we work to keep them together, and when is that line crossed that we need to take them out? I was just looking at an email from my CASA supervisor who said 2 weeks ago, Lynchburg removed 18 kids in a 3-day period. Like, that is a lot of kids for our town, you know, to be coming into foster care in a system that's already feeling pretty strained. You know, there's a CASA waiting list of dozens of children. I look around at our resources and I think these are our most vulnerable people in our community. What can we do to better help that? And I know that there's a number of things at the state level and the federal level. I saw that the General Assembly actually just launched a new Facebook page with their all about foster care that sort of ties into some of the new legislation. Is that, from your perspective, sort of as a lawyer and just being aware and up on this issue, are there particular things that you're really looking for or that you're excited about?
Well, I think the drive to recruit more foster families is critical. In Rockbridge County, where I am, there are a handful only. So children who come into care are not staying close to their families, they're not staying in their schools, they are going out across the Commonwealth. And again, that's another trauma that a child has to go through on top of that separation already and the abuse that they've already suffered. So we desperately need more foster families. Our family has had a situation just in the last few months where we've taken in a child who had no other options. He's not in the system. We're not foster parents. And we don't want to necessarily have to be in the system. So when you talk about taking steps to keep families together, to keep them from adding to the caseload, then it shouldn't take hours and hours and hours to go and sit and wait at your local social services office to fill out forms for Medicaid, for example, for coverage. And yet that's what it takes. And it's not the fault of the workers. My mother was actually a social worker in Kentucky, and she said she stopped when she went on a home visit and a gun was held to her head. So we, when we talk about the foster care system and the system and social services, I think you and I can agree that it's not about the men and women who are on the line, who are working so hard, many of them carrying really high school debt for the education that it takes to be a social worker, and they're very committed to the families. I worry about the burnout rate. As a lawyer, I have had to introduce myself, and again, this was back in Kentucky, to so many new social workers, and I always would try to take the time to explain that as a lawyer, I'm working with you. We may go to court, and there may be a case where I'm arguing for a parent, so I'm going to be arguing to make a case plan maybe less restrictive. And then the next 5 minutes, I'm going to come back and I'm going to be representing a child, and I'm going to be arguing and really supporting the case plan that you've put out there. And to understand that that's what my role is in this situation, is to be an advocate. So to help, I think social workers are expected to do so many things, right? You have to know how every part of the system works. You have to be a little bit of a therapist because you're dealing directly with the child. Or you're the person who's spending the hours before that placement is available, or driving that child around, or helping them put their belongings into a plastic bag because that's all they have, if they have anything to bring with them. So I think supporting our social workers is really where we begin to help, and that's funding.
Yep.
That's funding, and that's money. And as with everything else in our budget with the state, it comes down to priorities. And I think a lot of people like to talk about how we support children, we care about families, but you and I know that it really means support at that very basic level, which starts, I think, with having enough workers so they're not overwhelmed with their caseload, having the ability to pay and compensate not just the social workers, but their managers, their supervisors. We expect a lot from people and pay very, very little, just like we do with our teachers. So I think I'd love to see in Richmond that we really do make these reforms our priority, and we shift money in the budget to help those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things I found really frustrating was the General Assembly finally got this agreement that we needed more social workers per child in the schools.
Yes.
Right? So it's not just the social workers working in the Department of Social Services, right? It's the social workers that are out there in the community, in the schools or other places. Finally got agreement that we should increase the ratio, and everybody agreed. But then the budget discussion came and it sort of fell apart.
Right.
And I think that we need to be looking about putting our money where our mouth is, right? If we agree conceptually that we should have more than one social worker per, I don't even know what it is now, 500 something, then we need to find resources to do that. I think one of the things, so being a foster parent up in Northern Virginia and now at CASA down here, that I've really noticed is being in a rural district exacerbates all of the problems. Specifically around distance, is that if you are asking a child to now be, not even asking, you're telling a child
they don't have any choice,
right? There's no
this.
choices there.
No.
To be 45 minutes or more away from their biological family, because we have so few foster families, you may also be splitting them up so that they're not with their siblings.
Oh, that is
so now not only can they not see their family as often as they can, they're also separated from their brothers and sisters. But to say, and they are either getting driven back to school or more likely pulled out of their school and put somewhere else. But now add in, now you have to drive 45 minutes each way for your therapy once a week. Now you have to drive 45 minutes each way to go see your doctor. And maybe you haven't seen a doctor as often as you should have. So now we're going to try to make up for 10 years of lacking medical care in the next 3 months. So at least once a week, we're going to get you to a dentist and an eye doctor and an ear doctor, you know, all of those things trying to do that. And now we're going to bring you in for court. And now we're going to bring you in for biological family meetings. You know, some of our placements are happening, you know, a placement in the city of Lynchburg may be actually with a foster family out in Bedford or in Campbell or Amherst or Nelson County. It just, the distance magnifies all of the struggle. And I think, you know, ultimately the goal is return to family, right? We know kids do best when they are placed with their biological families, if at all possible. But that strain also impacts the biological family. If we have families who maybe in poverty, may not have their own access, to, may not have their own vehicle, asking them to use public transportation to get out to far-flung places out in the counties, we're throwing up barriers that make it, I think, harder for parents to work their plan, to get in a place where it's safe to have their kids come back to them. And I think that's when I think about, from a policy perspective, from a resource perspective, from a collaboration and coordination among our regions. You know, every county has its own plan and they kind of coordinate and kind of collaborate, but everyone's already overworked, underpaid. There's not enough people. There's, you know, we're just onboarding new social workers as others have left because of burnout. Trying to keep all of that going, that is really where I see state leadership or regional representatives having a role to play in really bringing people to the table and saying, how can we do this better? Because at the end of the day, right, if our families don't succeed, our communities don't succeed.
That's right.
And if our communities don't succeed, our state doesn't succeed.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot, both from my kids' perspective, watching them grow up and come up through that, and even years later, seeing the ongoing trauma that is, you know, they come into care with trauma, but we also traumatize them the system traumatizes them too. And I think about that a lot. Like how can we repair that, and how do we make sure that other kids don't experience that too? Yeah. Yeah,
it's hard, and prevention is the key. So investing in programs for addiction recovery, especially with the opioid crisis. Also support for the relatives who are willing to take in children if they qualify as relative foster families or just are doing it on their own. I worked extensively with a group back in Kentucky called Grandparents as Parents, or GAP. And they had a conference every year. Hundreds of people would come from all over the state to come together. These are grandparents, aunts, uncles, sisters, other family members, and we would volunteer as attorneys to give free consults. And sometimes that would turn into a case that we would take on or help or try to connect someone with an attorney in their area. But when you have 70, 75-year-olds and older taking in small babies, especially babies been born addicted, taking in toddlers, just when they thought that maybe they would be holding grandbabies or great grandbabies. That is the other, I think, real area where we need support. So it's a way to take some of the burden off of the formal foster care, but remember that these children are being placed oftentimes in homes that already have very, very limited income and don't have the ability to go out and, you know, second or third job if you're caring for a young infant is not possible. So that's a really big need that I think has just exploded, especially with the opioid crisis.
I totally agree. And this is a great example, I think, of where the foster care system is just like one piece of a huge umbrella of issues, right? Because it's affordable housing. If you have people that need to move up, instead of renting a 2-bedroom apartment, now need a 3-bedroom apartment, and there's just an utter lack of affordable housing, they may not, if they can't afford to move up, they may not be considered as a placement because of the rules around which kids have to have their own rooms and how many kids you can put in a room. But it's access to food. Food for growing kids is expensive. I mean,
yes, we have 3 teenagers in our house this summer.
I mean, they will eat you out of house and
they're
home.
like locusts.
And this idea that historically kinship placements, so family-based placements, have not been able to get the stipend that formal foster families have.
That's right.
And we know that kids do better when they're placed with family, even if it's extended family. Yeah. I think that's those type of areas. How do we make it easier for kids to stay? If they can't stay with their biological parents, are there relatives, and what are the barriers there?
Well, we're being penny wise and pound foolish to not support the family members who are willing to step in. We really are. Because what we're doing is we're funneling more children into the bigger system where they just need even more help and more resources, and it really is more expensive in the long run. Whereas supporting them in their communities or with their family members, it seems like it's more money, but in over time, I think it would save money, and it would, I think, foster reunification, because what I found in my experience is that when you have a child placed with relatives, you're more likely to have the willingness to do supervised contact with parents, supervised contact that's in a familiar home-like environment instead of meeting at a restaurant or a McDonald's or being at social services office where it's hard to relax. It doesn't feel natural. So I see those as more successful routes to actual reunification when that remains the goal. And I think that we also really can, at a state level, maybe create more resources. I know that there was legislation to try to create an office of an ombudsman this year. And I've worked with a comparable office, and it can be a good resource. So to have somewhere that foster parent or that relative custodian can call and get some help, that would be, again, penny wise, pound foolish not to have that at a resource, because I think you can head off some of these problems at the pass.
Absolutely. It is that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think as a foster parent, not knowing what you don't know, right? You're sort of told that there's resources, but then you think, right, is this normal? Is there something wrong? How aggressive should I be on this? And social workers, again, for as generous as they are with their time, are overworked and don't necessarily know all of the available resources to you in your community. And really having that extra support, that center of information that you can go to that becomes the repository. But I think people sometimes, you just want to raise our taxes. And I think Virginia has one of the worst, truly one of the worst states for foster kids aging out of the system.
Yes.
So they come out of the, they turn 18.
Statistics are terrible.
Without, I think we're like 49th or 50th ranking.
Twice as many age out as the national average.
And what we know from all the research is that is really expensive. 50% of foster youth in Virginia are homeless or have a baby or are incarcerated within 2 years of aging out. That's an incredible burden on the state. All of those social services, all of those, all the Medicaid, all the WIC, all the food stamps, all of those things that I think sometimes people say it's too easy for people to get. Well, if you want fewer people on them, what can we do to prevent it? And the more that we can invest in our foster youth and our families, preventing them from getting into foster care, keeping them together, and for those that get into foster care, really making sure that they have families before they age out. That pays for itself, right? That pays for 15 ombudsmen. Right.
Well, we actually, in the House of Delegates right now, we have an example of a really positive success story with foster care. Delegate David Reed was born in Rockbridge County in Buena Vista. And when his father could not take care of him and his siblings, they went to the Methodist home in Richmond. And Delegate Reed ended up with a wonderful foster family, entered the military, and now he's in the House of Delegates. And I think about, a story like that that being in foster care does not have to mean you don't have the opportunities for success in your life. It really depends on the message you receive as a child in that process. Do you have a CASA worker who's been there with you from beginning to end, who said, I'm here for you and I will support you? Have you had consistent contact with your relatives if they're appropriate, your birth parents if they're appropriate, if you're not going to be reunified? Has someone said, we care about your bond with your family? And have you had a social worker who's not overwhelmed with the caseload, who's been there, who's met with you? The monthly visits are happening in the home. In too many of our rural counties, our social workers just aren't able to perform these required visits. So again, instead of, it's so easy to sit here and maybe because we have been part of it and involved with it, that we're speaking from our experiences, but it just comes down to supporting people and to saying being a foster child or being in foster care does not mean that you cannot do anything any other child can do. It doesn't make you less smart. It doesn't make you less worthwhile. And it doesn't mean that you can't graduate from high school or get a great paying job or get a scholarship to college or have those benefits, be educated about what is available to you if you're going to age out. So for me, I refuse to give up on any child. I just can't do it. I've been in a courtroom sometimes where I've thought my 10-year-old child client is the only person in this courtroom with any sense, because he or she's an innocent child who just sees the world as full of possibilities, and it's kind of on us as adults to keep that open view. And where there's been trauma and abuse, to try to restore faith, restore a sense of trust. And it's not as simple as just budget items and policies and legislation. It really comes down to supporting the people, like you as a foster parent, like me as an attorney, or CASA, working with CASA, so that we have as good a system as possible. And then it's not about the system anymore, it's about the child.
Yeah. And I think one other thing I think a lot about is how much of this is intergenerational. For my kids, their mom was a foster kid, and was adopted, but was not able to break that cycle. And I talk a lot about with our kids, and we do have a great relationship with the biological family, and we
that's good.
We actually vacation with them every year. We go.
I love hearing that. I love hearing that. Yes.
Right. There's parts of it that are weird, but it's been so good.
No, that is good.
And I think about how my kids. We talk a lot about what it means to be adopted and what it means to be to grow your family in a different way, and what that means for their privacy and how they want to talk about their own story and what they share with other people. But I think, now that we've had them for at least 2 of our 3 kids for, almost, I don't know, going on 7 years now, I've really had the opportunity to see how their perspective on it has changed. Right at the beginning, it was just like, where's my mom, or when am I going home, and then it was, I'm adopted, and now it's much more nuanced questions about what does that mean, if they're, will I be mentally ill too, all of those things. And I think that is something that my kids and other kids in the foster care are going to live with their entire life. And I think about, beyond policy, beyond laws, but really just as a community, what can we do to really wrap our arms around the fact that this is happening in a lot of families, whether it ever gets to the stage of foster care or not. We have a lot of trauma in our families that we sort of carry with us, and recognizing that and just being kind to each other, and open to the idea that families are built differently, and that is okay. And our questions and our expectations and our hopes and our challenges and our disappointments change through life as we go through different stages. But I think there is so much we can do. And I'm really inspired by people like you that are, volunteering your time in the system, and the other CASAs that I work with, and the social workers. There's so many people fighting for these kids and doing the right thing. And I think it really is about, how do we remove the barriers to getting that success there? How do we get out of our own way to really, help these kids be really successful in their lives? That's what we all want, right?
Yeah, and I think the foster care caucus is a good start in Richmond, and to have delegates, to have senators who want to come together and really focus on this issue. And I think the other key is to listen. You have the advantage of having adopted foster children. You're listening and hearing, and a lot of people don't have that opportunity. So I think whatever we do in terms of policies and budgeting and statistics and caseloads, it's important to go and actually speak with the most vulnerable stakeholders and just in the most appropriate way to get an idea of, how would this change make you feel differently? And that's a perspective that often gets lost in a well-meaning way, but it gets lost because sometimes, and I've represented children not just in foster care, but in a lot of high conflict divorce cases and custody situations. And it's really interesting when children are able to speak to someone that they know really is all about what they want and not about taking sides. Because children will say one thing to one parent and the exact opposite to the other, because in the moment they just want to be loved by the adult that they're with.
Yeah.
And when I said earlier that it's all about survival, they speak to their own survival. But when you can gain a child's trust and have them really open up to you and talk about what they want, sometimes it's not what everyone's been assuming.
Yeah.
And that takes time to build that relationship. So again, it comes to supporting and funding enough workers, enough resources that a child's voice is heard. And what I used to tell children when I represented them is I said, you do not have a vote. The grown-ups are in charge, because really kids need to know that. They don't want to think they're the ones making the decision. But I'd say, you don't have a vote, but through me you have a voice. And we need to do that on a bigger scale.
I love that. And I think, isn't that so true for everything? More listening, less talking.
That's right.